Well, hi everyone. It's Brian Scruton. I live in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm married to Lindsay, my beautiful wife, and I currently have a son, Colin, who just turned 8. And I have two beautiful rainbow babies, Grace and Eve, who are now 5 and 2. You could probably hear them running upstairs like little baby dinosaurs, but yeah, it's great to be here, Allison. I'm excited to talk to you and hopefully reach out to other dads. And I should mention, I'm also the host of the Guys in Grief podcast. If you're listening, please check it out. It's geared towards helping guys who have gone through all sorts of infant loss. So it's not just one specific avenue of infant loss. We address every type, whether it's miscarriage all the way to, babies passing away in their sleep. So excited to be here.
So we're jumping into it. So how, first of all, tell a little bit about how you came to know about First Candle, and why you decided to join the board.
Sure. So my wife and I, we had our son Colin, very healthy pregnancy, healthy baby. Everything was wonderful. Our first child, we had just moved to Fairfield. And then we got pregnant with our second son, Austin Henry Scruton. And the pregnancy was very clean, no issues. And then, Austin was born and he was, the brightest star in our world. We were so excited to have, Colin and Austin to be brothers. And then the worst day of our lives happened 5 weeks and 2 days into Austin's life. We woke up that morning. We had put him to bed like any normal night. And we woke up the next morning and he wasn't breathing. And I remember it vividly. Unfortunately, I still live with that memory every day. It was horrible. And we had to go through everything that any parent, dad has to go through when that happens. We had to deal with the police, the paramedics, had to be shipped directly to the hospital, and had to spend the afternoon essentially holding our dead baby, which again, I say it out loud. I don't talk about the specifics of the story that often because it's tough to talk about, as I'm sure people listening to this can understand. Um, yeah, and then we had to go back to the house, make funeral arrangements, meet with detectives, um, to talk about the situation, which was even more horrifying than I could ever imagine. And there was a pamphlet that was given to us at the hospital, and on it, it had a SIDS organization. It wasn't even First Candle. I think they had your home address at the time, Allison. And we reached out, we reached out to the organization, but we also had some mutual friends that obviously knew what you did as executive director of First Candle, and said, we have friends that just experienced a loss. You should reach out to them. So, within a week and a half, which by the way, we still were in the darkest days of our lives of, I can't even explain the numbness and the absolute horror that we felt in those moments. But there was a little bit of, hope and brightness when you showed up to our door, because you went through the same experience we did. And everybody we had talked to at that point was giving us the generic, I'm so sorry for your loss. Time will heal, all those typical responses you get when somebody goes through a loss. And it meeting you and learning about your story and Connor, really helped us, you know, obviously it takes time and we can talk about that, but I think for us to see another parent that has gone through what we've gone through and is still standing, because at that moment we didn't even think we'd get through the day, let alone, weeks, months, years. It really helped us a lot. So, and then that's where the relationship blossomed from there.
And, I always say this, and I think you do too, because I'm so grateful you are on the board because one of our main tenets, as you know, is saving babies, but supporting families. And as we say, even if there's not one more Sid's death, there will always be us having those milestones that are missed. And we always say it's the worst club to belong to, but once you do, God finds ways to bring us together. And you're right.
Yep.
It was kind of kismet how we came together. And I feel like that whenever we talk to people. Um, I want to talk a little bit about how you coped versus Lindsay, because I know that when we get calls from dads, a lot of times they feel like they have to be the strong one for their wife and they can't grieve in front of her. And at the same time, in many cases, especially stillbirths and miscarriage, it feels like all the focus is on mom and dad's kind of pushed aside. So how did you two deal with that and what was the differences?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we talk about it a lot on the Guys in Grief podcast to try to learn, because it's very different. It really is, and I think a lot of ways men grieve is a generational sort of perception of how men are supposed to provide for the family, be the rock for the family, not show emotion. I think is the biggest difference, where, something as little as crying can be perceived as not being strong or being, the rock stability for the family. Clearly Lindsay was emotionally, physically, every way you can imagine upset, and I fully was trying to support her, but also try to manage my own grief, which was very strong. And it's a very tough balancing act to try to be there, especially in the early days. And this goes for, you know, miscarriages, stillbirths, Sid's death. It's the dad, you still have to go through funeral arrangements. You still have to manage family. You still have to manage presents, gifts, everything that goes on. And you still have to provide money for the family, depending, everybody has different situations. But then there's the whole work concept, which we talk a lot about on the podcast, because in a lot of cases, men have to decide, are they going to go back to work? When do they go back to work? And a lot of men feel that inner urge that they have to provide, and especially from the financial standpoint. So, and that's a tough thing to do, to just go back on living your life, going to your job, meeting your coworkers with the grief weighing on your shoulders. So I think it was different in the sense that it was much harder to show emotion, to talk about what happened, when internally you just feel like it's a generational thing, and it's different for every guy too. But I think for me personally, and a lot of guys we talk to on the podcast, it's a masculinity. I need to be the rock. I can't show emotion or vulnerability.
Yeah. And I think from what I know of you guys, I felt right away that your marriage was going to survive because you two were so good at communicating and respecting each other's grief style. Um, Talk a little bit about what you would say to men about how to communicate with their partner through this.
Yeah, communication is the absolute most important thing to do. And I know at this point it's a lot easier said than done. because I know that grief. I know that you know that grief. And it's really hard to focus on communication and expressing your feelings when you're feeling so sad and so down. But what I can say to other dads is that it's a very important and easy to lean on your significant other, because when we went through the loss, we didn't, as I said at the beginning, we didn't know anybody who went through what we went to. In that moment, it was me and Lindsay. That was it. And that was the beginning of the communication that facilitated it, because I felt like she was the only person that I could talk to that understood the pain that I was going through, and vice versa for her too. And I think that's was the first step of establishing good communication, was knowing that one another are in it together, and us fighting or blaming or feeling guilt and not communicating is not, it wasn't going to make Austin come back. It was making things worse. And we always felt that talking to each other, and again, this wasn't like a formal, let's have a conversation. It took time. It wasn't an immediate thing. And the time varies for every person. But I think ultimately we ended up meeting with our minister. And I'll say that with a caveat that we're both Catholic. We're not crazy uber religious. I don't want to get into that side of the discussion, but our minister was sort of our age, and he was a really good listener. And it really was, he was a sounding board for me. Even though I was talking to him, I was really talking to Lindsay. And same goes for Lindsay. She would talk to him, but I'm listening to what she's saying. And whether it's a minister or a friend or a relative, that's always an easy way. If you can find somebody that's a good listener, that's not going to judge or make comments about how you should be feeling, that was a good facilitator, or a minister was a good facilitator of that communication. It's so important. And my advice would be to try to find some person that you could either sound your thoughts off or tell each other how you're feeling. If you're feeling down, say it. Don't feel like you have to sit there as a man and say, I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm going to go do the next thing. I'm going to go do some yard work. I'm going to take the moment to say, I'm feeling really down right now. Like I can't do this or that. It's important, because I think seeing Lindsay sad made me sad, but also her hearing me say that I was sad makes her feel like she's not alone.
Right, right. And I think that is hard for women because they feel like they're disattached from their partner when you do put up that wall, and it's like, what's that about? So yeah, that's really, really important. I think the other thing I always talk to people about is Americans don't understand how to grieve.
Yeah.
We got into that whole, stages of grief, and no one told us that it's not linear. There's the
Yeah.
day you're angry, and then you go back to denial, and then you
Yeah.
bargain,
Right.
and it's messy, and it's everybody's different time. And I always say there is no should, right? You shouldn't be, it's not that you should be over this at a certain time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I talk to dads who have gone through loss, a lot of them ask, when am I going to feel better? And it's, there's no right answer, and it's not linear. And you're right. I think, the early grief research put it in stages. So everybody thinks it's like, sadness and then anger and then resentment. And, but it isn't. Like you almost have all of that all at
Yeah.
once. And then you're going to have days where you're feeling better. And then it's going to be right back to where you were.
Yeah.
There's triggers, there's milestones. There's no right way to do it, but having open communication, building a good community, finding the resources. We were lucky to find you, and we've been lucky to find other people in this loss community that have made us feel less alone. And everybody we meet is in different stages of it, and I
Yeah.
think every lost parent is looking for hope because the sadness and the grief is so strong and it weighs on you. And seeing somebody or a family that is moving forward, not moving on, I think is helpful. And that's why the community is not the community any of us wanted to be in, but it really truly is some of the best people I've met since we lost Austin.
I couldn't agree more. And that idea of hope, and that, as you know, is why we have the name First Candle, to get every baby to their first birthday, but also to be that light guiding through the darkness and
Yeah.
offer that hope. You and Lindsay and me and my husband at the time, we both had our rainbow babies pretty quickly, and that
Yeah.
was the right decision. But it's hard, right? Like there's
Yeah.
some people that are nervous about that. And so I'm sure on your podcast you've talked to some guys who maybe aren't on the same page about having the next baby, and they're scared. And how did you feel when Lindsay got pregnant with your rainbow?
Yeah, we had all the emotions that people listening to this have probably had or are having, where it's absolute fear. Because when you experience something like that, you don't ever want to experience it again. Like you're at your lowest moment, and especially for, miscarriages, stillbirths, where there's risk of getting pregnant again during the pregnancy. Lindsay and I were lucky enough that we didn't have a lot of issues during the pregnancy, but the fear is strongly there in your discussions with your significant other, because it's it's very hard, and there's a lot of circumstances that go into the decision. We talk a lot about on the podcast about how important our living children were. We were fortunate enough to have Colin, and Lindsay and I say a lot that he saved our life in a lot of ways, because he gave us purpose. And I understand there's a lot of people out there that don't have living children, and that makes the decision to try again even more difficult. But I would say take time. Don't have to jump into it. Some unless that's right for you. It was very tough, difficult, and I also understand, especially for guys out there, the physical component of jumping back into it again can be very hard, especially for women. We've had moms come on, and when you go through a loss, especially like stillbirths, where you essentially have to give birth, to your baby that's passed away. It's very hard to feel physically, attractive after you go through something traumatic like that. So again, I think what my advice would be, focus on your relationship, go on dates, try to rebuild what's important in the foundation of why you fell in love with your significant other. And then I think that's a good first step to then start having more realistic discussions of wanting to try again. Because if you just try and you don't have the foundation of each other's grief, or at least steps to working on it, and good open line of communication, it can be tough. But I think it's important to take time and then also focus on the relationship.
Um, what are some of the rituals or things you do as a family to honor Austin? And what are some ideas you can give other dads?
Great question. And we do a lot of stuff, and it's really important to us because the memory of Austin is very important to us. We want our living children to know that he is their sibling and never forget that he is part of our family. When people ask me how many kids I have, I say 4 kids. Um, it's we have pictures of him all over our house. That I mean, that's the simplest thing. But one thing we did early on is we started a toy drive for Austin. On his birthday was December 14th, so right before Christmas. We did a toy drive. We're 5 years into the toy drive. Every year it's gotten bigger and bigger, which has been amazing just to see the people that step up and in honor of Austin. And recently, we've taken more serious step where we've established the Austin Henry Foundation, which wasn't the easiest thing legally, but there's people out there that can help you set it up. And we have an account now through the foundation that we can use to help causes like First Candle and other families that are going through the same thing we went through. And it's a way to keep his memory alive. When we first met, I was in the process of doing a bowl-a-thon, which that year, obviously we did in Austin's memory and donated the money to First Candle. But, charitable activities are very helpful, keeping the memory alive because it gets people together to talk about him. Pictures are really important. Celebrating his birthdays, are important to us. We do a ceremony on his birthday where we send out a Zoom link. We say some, nice words about and memories about Austin. We share a slideshow of the moments when he was alive. And again, that's something that I did. Those are some ideas for our listeners. But no idea is like, this is what you should do to heal. Everybody can do something different. But I think it's really important that you don't shy away from telling the story. Because I know early on, it's very tough to tell the story because it just automatically creates an awkward position in the conversation where people don't know how to react. And a lot of times they're going to say stuff that makes you really mad.
Yeah, it's really disheartening, but so many times we find ourselves kind of comforting the other person. It's like, wait a second, why is this happening? And it's crazy.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I'm sure happens is so many people don't know what to say. Like, I'll never forget with Connor's birthday, people would say, well, I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want you to remember and get upset. I'm like, do you really think I forgot my son's birthday? Like, please. And I don't think people understand we want to hear our son's names. We want to hear what you remember about them, because that is the most important for us, that our child lives on in the hearts of everybody, not just us.
Yeah. I mean, we went to a friend's house, I want to say 4 months ago. They had a picture of Austin in their kitchen, and we literally broke down crying. And it was just because they said they think about us every day. They never told us they did that. It was just so, we happened to be at their house and we saw it, and it was an incredible moment. I recommend talk more and more, as awkward as it is, as much as you'll have moments that really make you angry based on how people respond. Power through it, because eventually you get to that feeling where you're confident, you feel good about saying his name, as opposed to worrying about awkward conversations.
And I hear this of myself too. You've taken a tragedy and made so much of it, but you really have with your podcast. And I think that's something that you did to heal, but also that memory. So tell us about your podcast, because it's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. So it was very organic. Like, it wasn't something that we thought like, oh, we got to go out and help this community of lost dads. it just so happened that one of my good friends, I was living in Stanford at the time when I met him, and we met playing dodgeball. We're friends for years. We went through our loss with Austin. 2 years after our loss with Austin, him and his wife struggled with miscarriages, and then they had to terminate for medical reasons. One of their sons, Beckham. So obviously I was the first person that he reached out to. I did everything in my power to try to be there for him. It was very tough, and especially that type of loss can be a difficult conversation to have with people. And then his brother-in-law, they went through a stillbirth around the same time, and it was devastating. And the three of us, were at an event and we were just talking, and Brad's got some experience in the podcast world, and he said, why don't we just get on the microphone and talk about it, and just focus on guys. We didn't expect any listeners. Like you said, we really wanted to bring more of a real dad perspective, where we say at the beginning of the podcast, we're not doctors, we're not therapists. We wanted to get away from that medical view of grieving. Not to say that that's wrong, but we know that dads, it's hard for them to listen to that a lot of times. And so we try to bring more of like a real perspective, real conversation, talk about real issues like, sex or going back to work, or how to, manage the relationship with your significant other, because that's really tough when you go through losses like that. And we interview a lot of dads, and it's been phenomenal, just the amount of dads we've met. And you realize that the community seems very small that we're in, but it's not. This loss happens across the world every day, and it's so devastating. So we've been lucky to meet a lot of these guys. I wish it was under different circumstances, but we try to bring a real perspective, and it's been successful, and we hope to keep it going for years and years, and be a resource, because when you go through a loss, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of resources out there. And podcasts, that's what people are doing these days.
Yeah, exactly. Brian, thank you so much for sharing all this. Is there anything else that you can think of? I know this is going to be airing around Father's Day, and that's got to be bittersweet too.
No, thank you for having me on. I love First Candle so much. You really helped us through so much in the early stages of our grief, and you really provided the support that we needed. Whether it was just texting you, calling you, your staff is amazing. So I just want to thank you. And I just encourage everybody out there, there's no right way to grieve. That's the one thing I've learned through this whole process, talking to other dads. Everybody has different ways to grieve, but I urge everybody to just be active in whatever you need to do to try to attack the grief, because what I've learned is isolation is the enemy. I mean, if you sit there in your grief, it's not going to get better. It's whether you need to have a beer with a friend and just talk to them, or if it's exercising, or if it's doing community events, just get out there. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. But as long as you're trying to move forward, I think is the best advice I can give.
That's great. Brian, I adore you. I adore Lindsay. Thank you so much for doing this, and we will be on soon again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.